Welcome back, everyone, to the 2021 Roundtables USA. I'm David Wagman, Senior Editor at PV Magazine USA, and I'm joined by my colleague, Tim Sylvia, Editor.
Happy to be here with you today, David. And we know none of this would be possible without the support of our networking partner, Recom, and our platinum partners, Clean Energy Associates and Longi, as well as our gold partners, whose names you can see on our multimedia wall. Thanks to all of them for their support of today's event. There are also lots of ways that you yourself can get involved in this event, and that includes right here on the main stage by submitting your questions to our speakers and panelists. On the event app, directly next to the live stream, you can send us your questions or comment, and you can even upvote other people's questions when it's something that you'd like to have addressed. Get involved because we are looking to hear from you.
We've already seen in our first session how hardware and software are evolving not only to make solar assets more efficient, resilient, and reliable, but also to enable solar to replace fossil-fueled sources of power generation.
But the job is by no means over. The imperative to address climate change and rapidly decarbonize the economy is of paramount importance. To that end, the Biden administration has set goals for the solar sector to rapidly expand, deploying solar at a pace as much as 4 times faster than our current rate.
But what obstacles need to be removed for that to happen? What policies need to be in place to support that sort of rapid deployment? What supply chain adjustments may be necessary? Those are issues that will need to be addressed in the next 1 to 5 years.
Longer term, how can solar best position itself as the foundation built to decarbonize and electrify economies here and abroad? Energy storage in the form of electric vehicles, large-scale batteries, and even green hydrogen all are well-suited to partner with solar. But how can that cross-cutting deployment of resources be accomplished rapidly and cost-effectively? We'll tackle those issues here in the next 2 hours.
To get us started, I'm pleased to welcome Garrett Nilsen, the Acting Director for the U.S. Department of Energy's Solar Energy Technologies Office, which advances research and development. Garrett has managed over 100 R&D projects. Multiple technologies from projects he managed are now actively used in the solar energy industry. He is specialized in the transition of research and knowledge. He holds a BS in physics from Union College in New York and an MS in solar energy engineering from Dalarna University in Sweden. Is Garrett with us? Hello. Hello, Garrett.
And hello, good afternoon.
Glad to have you. On a personal note, I have to admit that my wife's family is from Dalarna in Sweden, and I have the bragging rights to be able to say that I've been in both Nusnäs and Tifors. So not to distract, but...
Oh, excellent. No, I'm always excited to meet someone who's been there before. That's great.
Glad to have you. Please, Garrett, your presentation.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you all for joining today, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here. So I'm going to discuss briefly the Solar Future Study, which is a newly released study that the Department of Energy put out looking at what impact solar could have in the United States in the years to come. Really quickly, my office's mission is to advance solar energy technology with the goal of decarbonizing our electric grid by 2035 and the economy no later than 2050 in line with the Biden administration goals. Our goal is to ensure that solar energy is affordable and accessible while ensuring a reliable, resilient, and secure grid, all while ensuring that we are growing the economy, growing manufacturing, growing jobs, and ensuring that we have a circular economy to make sure we're using all of our resources efficiently. The Solar Future Study was an ambitious research project, primarily led by the National Renewable Energy Lab. It took about 18 months to really look at what the potential for solar is in decarbonizing the electric grid and energy systems by 2035 and 2050, respectively. So this looks at a variety of different scenarios, and I'll just cover a very high level with you here today, and I really encourage you and others to take a look at this very comprehensive and wide-ranging report. So in terms of the key results, we need to deploy. So the gigawatt numbers you're going to see from me today are in AC. So last year, we installed about 15 gigawatts AC in the United States. We have to be installing an average of twice that, basically between now and 2025, and even more than that between 25 and 2030, 60 gigawatts per year, to reach essentially a terawatt of solar by 2035, which would meet 40% of electricity demand. And if we're looking at decarbonizing the energy system, we're looking at 1.6 gigawatts, which would get 45% of all that energy demand by 2050. So this will change workforce, supply chains, siting and permitting, everything you can think of. And we're also going to have to see massive growth in wind and storage to complement this. Of course, we're going to have to continue to advance technologies in order not to increase prices, which will certainly be a challenge, but we believe it's feasible. Focusing on a grid that's reliable and resilient, expanding the clean electricity supply so we can deeply decarbonize things such as buildings and transportation and other areas. And of course, some policy changes, which our research assumes to get to a 95% decarbonized grid. So we looked at 95 instead of 100, because that last 5% is a bit challenging to model looking at for that in the future. Very quickly, looked at 3 scenarios. So sort of business as usual in the reference scenario, decarbonization, and then decarbonization with mass electrification. You can see in each of these cases, we need a very different trajectory in order to reach these goals as shown in the chart on the right. And you can read more about the assumptions inside the report itself, but these are the 3 main lenses through which we looked at solar deployment in the US. So what does that future energy mix look like? In a reference scenario, you can see on the left that fossil fuels still play a very large role in our electric grid out into the future. So this is looking at the electric grid in 2020 today, and there would still be a large role if we looked out into the future as well. Looking at 95% decarbonized grid in 2035, you see fossil fuels still being a small amount at the top, but really it's wind and solar that are really coming to the forefront in order to be able to provide all the electricity that we're going to need. And again, this is 1,000 gigawatts of solar that will need to be installed by 2035. We're going to look at mass, kind of a decarbonized grid, looking even further out. That energy mix becomes even more and more solar focused, even more and more renewables focused. And you see that we're going to need solar feeding into everything from electricity to industrial processes to transportation. And so we really need to think about how we can diversify the usage and increase the value of solar such that we can get to this zero emissions future. And again, in line with the Biden administration goals, And if we really want to get to a full decarbonized energy system, we're looking at, up to maybe 3 gigawatts of solar being needed. So it's really quite an incredible feat that would be needed to move this forward. But we believe that with continuing advancement in technology and thinking about this with the right policy incentives, that we can see this come to fruition in the US. So how much solar deployment is actually going to be needed? Again, looking at a decarbonized grid, and I realized I misspoke earlier, for 2050, just to have a decarbonized grid, we need 1.6 terawatts of solar. Something a lot closer to 3 terawatts or 3,000 gigawatts is needed to decarbonize the totality of the energy system. So these are kind of simplified analyses, but they do just show that rapid growth is needed. You look at all of these numbers and you think today in the US, there's about 80 gigawatts deployed, give or take. We're deploying at about 15 gigawatts a year. So really some step changes need to come to see this kind of deployment. And of course, the supply chains need to be in place to be able to deliver all of this product to see all of this change happen. So one big question people always ask us is, will this actually be costly? So looking out to 2035, and I think this is one of the most fascinating outcomes of the report, we did the reference scenario, which is sort of business as usual, figuring out what the cost would be, what a decarbonized electric grid would look like, and what a decarbonized plus electrification grid would look like, then translated that all to normalized dollars in 2018 per megawatt hour. You can see here that the decarbonized and decarbonized plus electrification case actually may come out, it's all in the noise at this point when you're modeling on this side, but it's very comparable to what the reference case scenario would be, and potentially even slightly lower. And so this could result in some net savings on the order of trillions of dollars for the US economy, all while making sure that end users of electricity have the same, have relatively unchanged prices. Of course, creeping up over time based on just normal inflation. But as you can see here, again, looking out into the future, we don't expect to see major changes in electricity costs in the US, which would really be something incredible, while we also gain savings related to avoiding climate damage, increasing air quality to help with health and other positive outcomes. The second really interesting part of this, and I think this might be the most sought after image from the whole report, I think it really drives home what's needed here, is looking at the contiguous United States. So this is the lower 48 states, how much land we use for a variety of different things, and how much land we would need to develop by 2050 to decarbonize our electric grid. And so what you can see here is that agriculture takes up essentially about 80 times as much land as the solar area that would need to be covered. And so this is really something that shows that America, we're lucky to have a lot of land. We can figure out ways to find synergies between, say, different kinds of land uses, then we could really drive some positive outcomes while letting nature stay nature. So we're aggressively looking at how can we look at the intersection of solar energy plus agriculture for dual use land. How can we be deploying solar on urban areas, next to roadways, above roadways, and so forth, and figuring out how we can use previously disturbed land, again, to leave as much nature in nature while still having plenty of headroom to be able to cover all of our energy needs from solar in these instances. Finally, one big question, or I shouldn't say finally, there's one more slide after this, but will transmission be needed? The answer is yes. This is something that will certainly be a challenge. Transmission growth is always a bit tricky as people want to see renewable energy delivered, but might not want to see it in their backyard. So this is just really to illustrate the amount of transmission that will be necessary to reach these goals, which is quite a bit. And this is something that the Department of Energy is very much focused on, and particularly in the new infrastructure bill that just is passing recently, has a big aim towards increasing transmission capacity as well, so we can maximize the use of renewables in the United States. So one last item is how much waste are we talking about generating? It's no secret that eventually things will get old and we will need to replace them. And so we are trying to be very cognizant of how are we going to be designing systems in the future? How are we designing modules in the future, such that we can create as circular economy as possible while minimizing any increases in cost to the consumer. So again, we're looking to try to maximize the amount that's recycled in different of our technologies, maximize the recovery of materials, and create kind of markets that will drive this into the future. So this is an area, again, of focus for us. We know there's a number of others in the international community looking at this as well, and we look forward to collaborating and learning from one another from across the world so we can figure out how to make this as sustainable of a sustainable energy transition as possible. So I threw a lot at you all right there. I hope that this is just enough to whet your palate and make you go download the report. It's freely available through the Department of Energy. I'll be sure to send the organizers a link to it, and please take a look. There's a lot of really great information in there. I'm only scratching the surface here. So I thank you all for your time, and yeah, I encourage you all to take a look.
Garrett, thanks very much. I wonder if I could ask just a couple of questions in the time that we have. You mentioned supply chains, and you mentioned the importance of deploying a lot of solar very rapidly. And there's been a lot of talk all the way across the U.S. economy recently about jammed supply chains and labor shortages, not to mention the trade and tariff tensions that are unique to the U.S. solar industry at present. How do you think the administration's goals could be affected by these ongoing economy-wide challenges?
Yeah, sure. So we certainly keep a very close eye on that here at the Department of Energy. We're in close contact with all other agencies that also impact the space, and we're actively trying to look for solutions to break some of these bottlenecks. Ultimately, in the Department of Energy itself, and particularly my office, the Solar Energy Technologies Office, we feel we really need to make sure we take a long lens in thinking about how we solve this problem. Hopefully these supply chain issues are kind of more of a figment of what's been happening over the last few years as consumption increases and change as we come out of the pandemic. So we're really trying to take a 5, 10, 20-year view, a decadal view, if you will, on what needs to be done and making sure that for the long run, the solar industry will be able to get all the resources it needs here in the United States and hopefully be able to manufacture a lot of that domestically. So a long way of saying it's something that we're keeping a very close eye on, but we're also trying to take a long lens view to this and make sure that it's over the long run that ultimately we're going to be able to hit all of these goals. But certainly we're very cognizant of the near-term challenges and are actively working across the government and across industry to buy set.
Good, thank you. And we have a little bit of an audio problem, but as long as we still have you, just one moment. Let me ask another question. There's a lot of interest, certainly, in the Build Back Better bill that is still before Congress. And of course, Congress passed and the President signed at the end of last week the infrastructure bill. And I'm wondering how much of the administration's goals can be done with policies from the federal level, and then how much depends on really state and local policies in order to achieve these ambitious goals that you've outlined.
Yeah, so in Build Back Better, I think one of the more exciting elements that's currently under discussion there is potential support for domestic manufacturing. And again, that comes back to securing our domestic supply chain and access to the energy. Ultimately, the state policies have been a big driver to get solar to the space where it is today. But right now, it seems that solar is really on a trajectory where it is, I don't want to jinx myself and call it an unstoppable force, but it is such low cost compared to all other energy sources in the US that the build out is really growing organically and is really being pushed by market dynamics and less so by individual state incentives or federal policy incentives. So we're certainly, or I shouldn't say we, but the folks in Congress are still thinking about long-term policy incentives, whether it's investment tax credits, manufacturing tax credits, and so forth. But we are now at a point in the US where we're seeing such low electricity costs come from solar energy that we believe that we're on a hopefully self-sustaining trajectory where really it's the financial centers and the markets that are driving us forward and less the need for actual policy.
Well, Garrett Nilsen, Acting Director of the Solar Energy Technologies Office for the U.S. Department of Energy, thank you very much for getting our second session underway. It's very good to have you on board. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and I look forward to listening to the next round of speakers. Thank you very much.
Once again, our thanks to Garrett Nilsen. A little later in the program, we will have a one-on-one with Michael Parr from the Ultra Low Carbon Solar Alliance to talk about supply chain issues and the recent work that the Alliance has undertaken to map a path forward.
So how do we turn these goals into action? What needs to be done to clear obstacles and build the capacity pipeline that a solar future will require? Joining us to offer specifics is our panel of industry leaders. With us today are Suzanne Leta, Head of Policy and Strategy at SunPower, Elizabeth Sanderson, Executive Director of Solar Energy International, Dean Solon, founder of Shoals Technologies Group, and Paul Wormser, Vice President of Technology for Clean Energy Associates. Welcome to you all, and let's get started.
And just before we get started, I wanted to do one more shout out to our sponsors because there was supposed to be a little graphic that went behind, but there wasn't. So one more time, a shout out. Oh, there you are. You can see them now to our networking partner, Recom, and our platinum partners, Clean Energy Associates, Longi, and our gold partners whose names you can now see up there. So again, appreciate all of the support from our sponsors.
Thank you, Tim.
And I'd like to kick off this next upcoming discussion, David, by juxtaposing our dream of an exponentially bigger and more robust solar industry with the stagnation that I know Dean specifically has seen and has become an unfortunate reality as of late. So I'd like to pose this first question to you, Dean, and Paul, if you could follow up, that would be excellent. Let's start with a nice, easy one. Can the supply chain meet the demand for rapid growth?
Ooh, that's an understatement on the rapid growth, especially if we have to crank it up ×4. The market's probably, the supply chain's not ready for that kind of growth. I think the manufacturers probably are not ready for that kind of growth. And the systems to install that kind of quantity of PV isn't readily available. And I'll pick on one that seems to be one of the favorite topics of the big utilities and of the EPCs is just getting permits approved. And the length of time it's taking to get permits through the system could take as long as building the entire PV system at the moment. And I don't know why we're bottlenecking the way we are, but solar is nothing more than a bunch of toothpicks in the ground with posts and solar sitting on it. Let it make power for 25 years, and once you're done, pull the toothpicks out and replace it and keep growing agriculture or whatever else you want to do on it. But it seems permitting, at least for a lot of our customers that we're doing major projects with, are getting bottlenecked in the permitting side.
Paul, anything to add with regards to the supply chain or permitting stagnation?
Yeah, a little bit of a different take. We often think about the supply chain as referring to the components that we buy and put into our systems, the modules, the racking systems, the inverters. But as Dean points out, the supply chain really should refer to a full ecosystem. So it is the components, and I'll talk about that. But it's also the logistics of getting those components from factories to field. It's the issues around constructing projects, which would include, of course, the permitting issues. It's the transmission and distribution that Garrett just talked about, and the need for more transmission in the United States to get power from generation source to consumption source. And then, of course, there's a regulatory environment that I think we can also consider to be part of the supply chain mix. When it comes to the component side, on the module side of things, there's plenty of capacity around the world for our needs in the US, but we have to start to winnow that capacity down into what's really available for the US. So if we take the total global supply and we think about the impact of tariffs, which limits the available supply to the US, we think about the issues around human rights, which further limits supply to the US. We think around issues of carbon footprint and ESG type attributes, which further limit supply. And we think about things around logistics that cause price increases and slow things down. We can even add into it the current issues with electricity supply in China, which while it's getting a little bit better, it's still an issue and limits supply. Then you come to the conclusion that there are some solutions we need to look at. And as Garrett said a few moments ago, the new legislation includes incentives for domestic manufacturing, what I call localization. And I think we need this. We need this to amplify the available supply to the US.
In an industry where the bottom line is pretty much everything and project costs are of the utmost consideration, and we're facing all sorts of difficulties in stagnation, Dean and Suzanne, I'd like to address this one kind of to you two, but anyone else, again, feel free to chime in. How can solar development costs be driven lower?
Would you like to go first?
Well, I'll start. Sure. And first off, I apologize. I'm remote and having some technical challenges, so hopefully you can all hear me. Thank you for your patience. I think the first thing with respect to development challenges is to recognize that there are different challenges based on the market segment. So in the residential market, the main challenge that we're still working to address are soft costs, the cost of customer acquisition, and the cost of permitting, and the cost of interconnection, versus the balance of system, which is the hardware and the rest of the components that are the system that's installed on the customer's roof and in their home or on their business. And one of the best ways that we can address the permitting side of the soft costs is through online instant permitting. We have invested, along with the Department of Energy and the national labs, a really an amazing tool called Solar App, which essentially allows local jurisdictions to permit systems online in an instant way. The technology is there, so now it's all about ensuring that those local governments that do adopt that tool and make it widely available. And not only does that reduce the soft costs in terms of the permitting costs, but it actually will grow the market in a different way, because it will speed up the time from the time between when a customer signs a contract versus when it is finally installed. And what that does is reduces customer contract cancellation rates. So there's some multiplying benefit of a tool like that. That's just one example, but it is a major challenge in the residential market that I thought I'd raise on this call.
So I'll say from our standpoint, we're on the other side of the business, which is the utility sector versus the resi, and I think the resi side does have it a little better controlled. But what we're doing to ensure continuity of projects is really intimately knowing who our customers are, which are the utilities and the IPPs, and then understanding how the developers and the EPCs play a role in that, and understanding what the project pipelines look like for 3-5 years out, and understand what those needs are going to be, and help them design those systems as quickly and as efficiently as we can. And then when the supply constraints have kicked in, we've had solutions available, or we've had designs or alternative designs in what we're shipping to. As an example, a project was designed, say, a year and a half ago, and they bought a bin class, say 380s or 400s, that those modules are now, let's say they're stranded offshore or they're not available any longer. What we're seeing is a lot of these projects that come in and say, I was going to use this module maker, and I'm going to go to the extreme side. I'm taking my project from crystalline to thin film. And you might as well start the whole project from the start, because that change, or that wholesale change in design, basically is going to take those fields and just transpose them forward. The projects don't die. It's just the timeline shift into 2 quarters forward until all those designs are validated, and then they go through the permitting and they go through HJs and all the other things that's required for those projects to start. So what we're trying to do is stay as close as possible to what modules are available, what inverters are available, and understand what suppliers are giving the constraints, and then having alternative solutions designed up when those issues arise. And they're arising quite a bit. I mean, if anybody says there's not a constraint problem in the globe, or a labor problem in the globe, they're living in an alternative universe.
I'd like to stay in this universe if we could, and I'd like to build on a point you just made there about labor. Elizabeth, obviously it's not just the hardware and it's not just the siting that's going to be needed to build the capacity of solar that we're hoping to achieve, but it's the people who will be doing the development, who will be doing the installation, who will be doing the maintenance on these projects. Where will the next generation workforce be found, and what skills will they need to have?
Yeah, the short answer is they're going to come from everywhere. And just to give you a perspective, SEI, Solar Energy International, trained 80,000 people in the first 30 years of existence in the solar workforce. And in the next 4 years, we'll train 275,000. So that's more than the solar industry today, the whole workforce, right? So it's a big issue. And with Biden administration aiming to have 40% of the energy produced by solar, we're going to need 1.5 million by 2035. So we have to get going. So obviously we need more people, and we need different people. So a couple of examples: 30% of the workforce now is women. Well, in order to reflect the population, that would have to be 50% of the workforce, the solar workforce. And 8% of the solar workforce now is Black. And in order to match the general population, that would have to be increased to 40%. So in order to do that, we're reaching out to many organizations. BOSS is one. It's Black-owned solar services. We're building a platform for women training women. We're talking to organizations such as Youth Build, which is 16 to 24. So it takes creativity and coordination and cooperation. And in terms of the skills, think of it as, a lot of people always think of it as just the installation, but it's sales and management and software. And so they need CAD, they need software, they need management skills. So it's really the gamut of the workforce, what the workforce skills need overall.
Kind of actually building on that skills conversation, and I'm glad you brought up a couple of organizations that are working to build those skills. How does training need to be rethought to address, not only to be able to effectively train a workforce of unprecedented size, but also one that's heading into a future that's going to feature, new technologies, new policies, new habits across the board that we haven't seen before?
Right. There's the worker need and the employer need. And so from a worker standpoint, people learn differently, and we're getting people from all over, everywhere, in different walks of life. And we need to give them both physical access and mental access. So we need to we're building labs around the country to allow people to have hands-on learning, because that's how some people learn. It's can't all be online all the time, right? And they have to have access mentally. So identifying skill gaps and filling that with our curriculum is one of the things we have to do. For instance, we have a free math course on our online right now. So getting that done, that's sort of the worker needs, and following them through their careers and making sure that we're there to help upskill them. And then for the employers, I've talked to so many employers, and they say, just get me warm bodies. I want someone with a pulse, right? And so we have to look at that and say, okay, how do we fulfill that need and have people trained so well that they're safe, and the job that they do is high quality job. And then we have that continued commitment to upskilling. So yes, let's get them on the job, and in 6 or 8 or 12 months, let's make sure that they're getting new skills and we're upskilling them. And there's always a need for continuing education in an industry like solar, because every day it changes, as we've been talking about. So I think it's both the worker needs and the employer needs that have to be looked at pretty much all times.
Right, and if anyone else from our panel has anything to, that was a very comprehensive answer, but if anybody else on the panel has anything to add to that, please take a moment now.
I'll join in on that one, because we run very manual processes. We run semi-automated processes, and we have some that are automated. And if I had my way, they would all just be human-based, because robots are cool and they work hard 24/7. But the robot doesn't go home and feed a family at the end of the evening. So, we can all say, yeah, let's automate our processes and do all this cool stuff. And all right, so we're going to send our workers home. Then they're going to be unemployed, and the robots are going to make a lot of parts. But in the end, it's humans trying to help humans survive, and solar's in that space heavily. So we're always kind of trying to find a balance of, where can we find people to implement into the process and make them feel like they're part of something that's growing and it's fun and it's cool and it's different, and yet not have to overly train them and make them feel like they have to be math majors. And I'm kind of taking it from the opposite side, as we try to make our processes so robust that we want you to come in and give us 10 hours of really good work. And if you're capable of making a mistake, shame on us. End of story. Shame on us. And we will work harder to improve that process, to take those failure modes away from you. And then you're using less supervisory skills, you're using less managers, and people kind of have their own buy-in in their own workstation on what they're accomplishing. And quite honestly, it's hard to find that balance, because if we're in it just for profit, everything should be automated with robots. But again, humans go home and eat, and they got families to feed in the evenings, and we can't look away from what makes everybody earn a living.
We've nearly reached the halfway point of our discussion here. So, David, I just wanted to check in, see if we have any audience questions yet.
Well, we don't, and that's a good reminder for our live audience to please send your questions to us and let us be your conduit. Tell us what you'd like to know so that we can ask our panel members. And Tim, if you don't mind, if you would indulge me, and the panel members would indulge me in letting me ask a question and direct it initially to Paul. And what we heard from Garrett Nilsen just a few minutes ago certainly was this ambitious plan by the administration for a 3 to 4x expansion of solar deployment. And yet what we're looking at is we see that we're already perhaps behind the time schedule that we would need in order to achieve that. We're seeing supply chain difficulties. We're seeing trade and tariff issues that are concerning for the industry. We certainly are seeing things related to labor. We're seeing there's been talk in the industry about the need for long-term certainty in policy, and yet we're still waiting for those pieces of legislation, to make their way through the Congress. What specifically do we need to do you think, to break through these log jams? What impacts do you think the trade and tariff issues are having? What needs to happen to the supply chain? Paul, how would you react to that?
Thanks for the question. I loved listening to Garrett earlier and the progress that he referred to. One of the messages that I got from Garrett's discussion was that market forces are getting so strong and so powerful that policy forces are becoming less important. I actually don't think that's the case. I think policy issues continue to be critical and essential. So we have opportunities at the state level and the federal level. What you've heard so far today is there are lots of issues. And David, you just rattled off several issues that need to be addressed. What we might think of as bottlenecks that need to be addressed if you think about theory of constraints and how do we get to that 3x or 4x or 6x deployment increases. Policy can take place in two very different forms. We can use what we call carrots or rewards, or we can use sticks or punishments. And from my perspective, I think we've learned that using sticks has consequences that are not necessarily what we intended for. The US right now pays more for solar modules than any other country in the world because of the sticks that we've put in place. They weren't meant to be punishments. They were meant to equalize conditions between US and other places. But the reality is that they have punished, in essence, the American consumer by raising the price of the products that we put into our projects. You know, a policy issue, a trade policy issue, a domestic localization incentive issue can be a lot to help us establish policies that get us to that accelerated rate. The other element about the policy side is we tend to have policies that can suddenly change or that are short-lived. And when you're talking about assets that are decades long, when you're talking about building factories that have decades of useful life, you need policies that are at least in the direction of that kind of longevity. So I'm encouraged. I'm very encouraged with the accomplishments that we have so far based on policies we've had, accomplishments that have led to unprecedented improvements in technology, amazing improvements in performance, incredible improvements in terms of cost reduction, but we're not done yet. And if we could have policies that give us some degree of certainty and predictability from a long-term perspective, if we have policies that help incentivize with the carrots and the rewards, the things that we want from behavior, from localization, I think we're moving in the right direction. So again, to go back to the beginning, market forces are in play and they're doing a lot, but we're not done with the need for appropriate policies to support the carrots and the rewards to help us get to that accelerated level.
Mm-hmm. And Suzanne, Leta, I have been watching, and you've been nodding and smiling. I think you have something that you'd like to add on this issue of, you know, getting things out of the way so that the industry can reach these goals. What are your thoughts, please?
Yes. Well, first, I should say that I'm here actually in DC at the Department of Commerce right now. So I'm speaking to the very people that would like to see these policies enacted. In particular, the ones that are so critical in the Build Back Better Act, which has not yet passed, right? So remember, for those of you listening, there's a full third of the funding in the Build Back Better Act is dedicated to climate and clean energy. It's that bill that includes all of the critical tax credits that we need, not just for solar deployment. So don't think about it as sort of, what do we do with what we already have? It's about accelerating that deployment very quickly. And we need those tax credits and the other enabling policies within legislation like that in order to ramp. And that's where we're missing out right now, is that quick ramp. The other areas where policy is really critical are with two things. One, equity. And number two, ensuring that our technology is integrated with other enabling technologies. So on the first, equity, it's one thing to ramp up renewable energy deployment, but if you don't do it with and serve the workforce and the communities that need the benefits the most, you are missing the game. You know, you're not winning the game. You're just sort of staying status quo, and that's not going to move our society forward. And then with number two, in terms of interconnecting different technologies, especially at the distributed level, it's not just about solar and battery storage anymore. It's about connecting with electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging and load management. And we need the right kinds of policies in order to move those integrated technologies forward, especially with respect to our distribution system. And by the way, that's where we get to grid resiliency. You cannot only do that through large-scale transmission and utility-scale development. It's critical that we have a blend of distributed resources on the grid and utility-scale resources.
Suzanne and Paul, in your most recent answers, you both referenced financial incentives to help, obviously, deployment grow. Could you kind of go over and outline how the role that incentives play has changed in the last decade or so? Kind of if the historic incentive model is still viable, and if not, what the new pathway would look like through incentives. And Suzanne, we can start with you, and then Paul, I would like you to build on that if possible.
Sure. Well, first I will say that we are lucky in this country that we have a federal investment tax credit that has that works. There's just decades, frankly, of history with a very, very successful tax credit program. And one of the best parts about the Build Back Better bill is that it establishes a 10-year extension of that tax credit and revitalizes it to the 30% value level, so meaning 30% of the capital cost of the system. That is really unprecedented. We've never seen a long-term extension like that, nor one at the 30% level for the full term of that extension. So we have policies that work, and it's about ensuring that they're available over the long haul. What's additional about that policy in that bill, which is really, again, a new thing and very much needed, is that it now, assuming the bill passes, will not just be available to solar technologies, but also to standalone battery storage and for microgrids. And then the last piece of it is that increasingly in the residential market, the vast majority of that market is actually served through cash and loan purchases. In fact, 70% of the U.S. residential market is purchased, residential solar market is purchased through cash and loan, and most of that, as of late, is through loans. And there's one section of the tax code that applies to those types of purchases. It's this Section 25D of the ITC. And that really works for a lot of customers because it not only allows them to have bill savings and resiliency, of course, but the ownership of the system is another form of capital, right, for that end-use customer. And what's really special about what's in that bill that we've never seen before is that for that part of the tax code, it's called Section 25D of that investment tax credit, the bill allows it to be refundable for individual taxpayers. That means that if that taxpayer is low income without sufficient tax liability, they can still utilize it to its full potential. And again, when we talk about equity, that is one really critical tool because the customers that are low income in this country, that are in historically marginalized communities, those are the people that need the bill savings and the resiliency benefits the most.
Paul, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, so to sort of paraphrase Gordon Gekko, money is good. Money is not evil. And financial incentives can do a tremendous amount. So you've just heard Suzanne talk about financial incentives in terms of tax credits, and they have been very successful. And if we get a 10-year extension, this could be earth-changing and help us save the earth. I do want to go back to sort of the production incentive side also that's in that bill. You may be familiar with legislation proposed by Senator Ossoff from Georgia that outlines a series of incentives for the supply chain to be localized in the United States. There's an incentive for making polysilicon. We have some polysilicon manufacturing in the US. There's an incentive for making wafers. We have no wafer manufacturing in the US, and 95% of the world's solar is based on wafers. We have no cell manufacturing in the US, but there would be a cell incentive for crystalline solar cells. We have some module assembly in the US, but if you take a look at all of the domestic supply that we have today, it makes about 20% of our current needs and certainly less than 20% of an accelerated program. So we want to increase localized production. We can't compete at the moment with the pure costs from Southeast Asia, but with these incentives, we can. And therefore, with these incentives in place, we would see more manufacturing in the US. We'd see current manufacturers likely go vertically integrated or expand. So these are, again, financial incentives other than the form of a tax credit, but in the form of what I think of as a production credit. The more you make, the bigger the incentive. That can be a long-term win, and I think that's what's proposed in the Build Back Better bill.
David, I'd like to kick it over to you to wrap the session up with a few audience questions.
Yeah. And Paul, this question coming in from one of our live audience members today touches on that point, and I want you to maybe take it a step further. You're talking about the domestic supply chain that can be created and where the deficiencies are currently. How long will it take, do you think, for the U.S. to build a robust supply chain? And then I'd like each of the other panel members to address that also, just kind of briefly, is what will it take and how long will it take? But Paul, what do you think? How long will that take to do?
Well, first of all, it's not a quick thing. It's not a quick fix. And that's why I think the benefits that are outlined in a 10-year program really help a lot. We also need to think about supply chain as not building one factory that makes one thing, but for us to be competitive on a global basis, we need to think about the entire ecosystem. So we often think narrowly about, assembling a photovoltaic module and where do we get the cell? When we're making the cell, where do we get the wafer? But if we go back to that end product, the module, we have to think about where the glass comes from. Where does the silica come from that's melted that makes the glass? Where does the encapsulant come from? Overall, the complexity of fully localizing a supply chain is enormous, and therefore the duration to get from where we are today to a fully developed, fully deployed ecosystem, that's quite a number of years. But we have to start, and we can start right now. We've already seen module assembly plants come to the US in the last couple of years. We've seen announcements from some of the manufacturers, including our very own thin film manufacturer for solar, about expansions. We're going to see more of this. We've seen some announcements now from other companies coming to the US. And if these incentives get passed and written into law that are proposed, I think we're going to see those come to fruition. And we're going to see more on top of that. And around those very specific factories that are very surgical in nature, we're going to see ecosystems develop. But it will take time before we have a full, comprehensive ecosystem.
Very good, very good. And Dean, I wonder just briefly, because we're running a little short on time, I wonder your thoughts. What does it take and how long does it take?
I'm very skeptical on a government helping this grow. Both sides suck, by the way. And market forces are going to really expand solar. If you're a CEO of a major utility and you have a coal asset coming to an end, are you going to put in another coal plant or solar? Solar's it. There's no stopping the solar train. It left the station, nearly a decade ago, and the government's going to have to do the bidding of the people, not the opposite way, because there's not one site that's not going to become solar or wind, and then tied to energy storage with microgrids and powering up EV. I mean, that's our new economy coming. And the good thing is the market forces are there for people to make money doing it. People are going to build module companies or battery companies, and hopefully the government helps them achieve it. I'm always distrustful of government, but hopefully they help, and everything keeps growing. But let the market run, and it'll run hard and fast.
Very good, very good. And Elizabeth, from an employment and a training point of view, what does it take for domestic supply, and how long does it take? And briefly, if you could, thank you.
It's exponential growth. As I said, in 4 years, we're going to have 275,000. We're working in cooperation with other training organizations. I don't quite have that mistrust of government, and I think it takes those funds to help us get there because we have to reach into a lot of places to get a diverse workforce.
Very nice. And Suzanne, please, your thoughts.
Well, I'm a believer that there's a very critical role between private industry and the public sector. And we've seen that by serving our own customers in the public sector, where they really understand the resiliency and the bill savings benefits of what we provide to them, and in turn are looking to find ways to further that so that those benefits serve more Americans. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, whether it's on the manufacturing end or on the installation end or sales and permitting. And I do believe, because we've seen it time and time again in this country's history, not just with the clean energy industry, but so many others, that when you have that influx of federal investment, that it produces results. So that's my expectation and my hope. I think I will leave it by saying that we really cannot achieve that without passage of that legislation. So it's a great success that we saw the bipartisan infrastructure deal move that will make a particular impact with EV charging, for example, but it's relatively inconsequential in comparison to all of the provisions within the Build Back Better Act that will be of major direct benefit to our industry and, most importantly, the customers and the people we employ. And so it's critical that we see the House and the Senate move quickly on that legislation and get it across the finish line.
Very nice. Thank you. This has been an insightful and thoughtful discussion. Our thanks to Suzanne Leta from SunPower, SIA, Elizabeth Sanderson from SEI, Dean Solon from Shoals, and Paul Wormser from CEA. Thank you all. We're going to turn our attention in just a little bit to a discussion of how solar can be the foundation for economy-wide decarbonization and electrification. But right now we turn to a one-on-one interview with Michael Parr, who is the Executive Director of the Ultra-Low Carbon Solar Alliance. He and I will explore supply chain issues that we just touched on just a moment ago, and how ambitious goals to deploy unprecedented amounts of solar can be achieved. Michael spent nearly 30 years at DuPont, where he worked on issues related to energy, the environment, and sustainability, and took on his current role with the Alliance in October of 2020. Michael, welcome to the Roundtables.
Pleasure to be with you, David.
I'm going to put you on the spot just a little bit and ask for you to be very specific and direct in what needs to happen. What we want to try to do is paint the picture of how the U.S. solar industry can achieve the Biden goals of 3 to 4x expansion in solar deployment rapidly, and from your point of view, with the interest in doing it with as gentle a footprint and as little carbon impact as possible. The alliance that you lead has recently taken a particularly close look at the solar supply chain, and I wonder if you could offer what new insights you have found as a result of that work.
Happy to. I think first, it's very clear that the supply chain is deeply overconcentrated in China now, on the order of 75 to 98% of each of the critical supply chain steps is now located in terms of overall capacity in China, which makes for a very unresilient supply chain. Secondly, there are significant sustainability issues that arise with that concentration. The Chinese industry has roughly double the carbon emissions as solar manufacturing elsewhere in the world. And I think we're all familiar with concerns about forced labor practices in Western China, particularly in Xinjiang province, where the expansion in solar-grade polysilicon has occurred. If we look at the amount of solar manufacturing that will happen in the coming decades to meet this strong growing demand, the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance has estimated that if that manufacturing occurs in China, as all the growth has occurred for the last decade, that within 10 years, solar carbon emissions will equal those of the global aluminum industry and within 20 years will be double those of the global aluminum industry. And over the next 20 years, that would mean 15 billion tons of CO2 emissions added to the atmosphere. Obviously, not a great idea. And these sustainability concerns comply even beyond the normal supply chain issues that other industries are experiencing right now. And if growth continues to occur primarily in China, we believe these sustainability issues present a meaningful material long-term supply risk that are a threat to our carbon goals.
So what specific adjustments to the supply chain would you recommend to be made to remove as much carbon as possible?
We think the key is a much more geographically diverse, resilient, sustainable supply chain, which means a lot more manufacturing in low carbon economies around the globe, not just in the US. Some of this is already happening. I think we're all seeing significant realignments in supply chains as folks try to avoid entangling themselves in the Xinjiang supply chain. So in the next couple of years, we'll see US module manufacturing capacity roughly double. We will see expansion in Europe. We're watching India very closely, and depending on how they develop the energy supplies for their expansion, that too could be relatively low carbon manufacturing. And we are seeing, I think, one of the really telling signs, David. It was mentioned before that wafering is a real choke point in the industry, 98% of that in China. Jinko, one of the big integrated Chinese firms, just announced they're going to build a 7 gigawatt wafer fab in Vietnam so that they can source US polysilicon, which is very low carbon. They can't get that in China because of tariffs. So they're creating a supply chain around Xinjiang so that they can serve this low carbon market. They've also, along with some other of the big integrated firms in China, begun to invest pretty heavily in some of the hydro-based polysilicon assets in Eastern China. Now, a long way to go for their supply chain to be transparent enough that they can segregate that poly from Xinjiang poly. Nonetheless, there's some pretty clear signals that change is coming. And we envision that that change will accelerate with a lot more manufacturing happening US, Europe, and Southeast Asia in the coming years.
And I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on the mix of manufacturing. There's a lot of interest and talk about expanding US manufacturing capacity. Is that the sole goal, or as you look globally, where does manufacturing need to be added, at what cost, and over what time period?
So not just the US, we think that this needs, if you look at the level of demand, no one country is going to serve all that demand. This is going to be a much better industry forward than it has been in the past. We're seeing policies develop in India to support investments across the solar supply chain. We're seeing policies develop here in the US similarly, everything from incentives for domestic content and the ITC extension. Your previous guest talked about the OSOF Solar Energy Manufacturing for America Act, which will incentivize rapid scale up. There is a bill introduced by Representative Demings that would provide capital support for initial investments in solar expansion, particularly important for some of the small to mid-sized companies like the European wafer companies that might want to come here. So we think there's a web of policies that are going to expand manufacturing in multiple locations outside of China. Most of those will result in low embodied carbon solar modules.
And there's been a lot of focus in Washington on the ITC and extending that as really being an underpinning for expanding solar deployment in the U.S. More broadly, what do you think, what specific policies do you think need to be in place, both at the federal level, but also at the state level, maybe even the local level, to really achieve the low carbon goals, the lowest carbon solar deployments? What does that look like?
So, you know, your previous guests are sort of a back and forth about policy versus market signals. And I think both play a significant role. We think of this kind of a three-legged stool. The ITC, the various grant and tax policies, very important to help buy down some of the very high capital costs in this industry. But a market demand signal is probably the most powerful thing. The ITC adder for domestic content is useful, but if buyers say, you know what, we are only going to buy low carbon solar modules going forward, and many are starting to do that, then the next tranche of manufacturing capacity is going to get built in low carbon economies because manufacturers may want to buy. And if your major carbon module, and so we think preferential purchasing by both public and private sectors for ultra low carbon solar is critical, which is one of the reasons we're really glad to see the Global Electronics Council adding low carbon solar criteria to their existing EPPV eco label, which will provide buyers a ready tool to specify with confidence.
Certainly, capital is an important component in building supply chains to be able to meet the ambitious goals for solar deployment. Do you see money being available and competitive enough to support a capacity build-out, number one, but then also a low carbon capacity build-out? What do the financial supply chains look like?
So this capacity is going to get built, right? The demand is there. The capacity is going to get built. It's really a matter of where it gets built. And globally, the cost of capital is still relatively low. The cost of manufacturing in solar has come down dramatically. You know, everyone has had to figure out how to compete with in a deeply commoditized market. So whether it's through high automation, whether it's through multi-gig scale manufacturing, we think you can now produce a supply chain in many parts of the world and still see the cost of solar continue to go down. So we are confident that, yes, it's tens of billions of dollars of CapEx to build out a meaningful supply chain, but that capital is in the world, and there's enough margin in solar to justify these expansions. If that wasn't the case, we wouldn't have seen dramatic expansions in manufacturing over the recent year, and would be seeing significant expansions of manufacturing outside of China already in response to these emerging demands.
Well, Michael Parr, the Executive Director of the Ultra Low Carbon Solar Alliance, forgive me. Thank you very much. We appreciate your perspective on this important topic. Good to have you with us.
My pleasure, and great job on the roundtable. Good luck with the best of it.
So far, our discussions today have been very American-centric, as you should expect for our U.S. roundtables. However, even with the incentives for U.S. manufacturing and domestic supply chains, the fact of the matter is that America won't be accomplishing this energy transition alone. We will still have to coordinate with the rest of the world to see real change. To expand on our all-American outlook, we'd now like to welcome Vartan Oskanian, advisor to the CEO of Recom, and Hamlet Tunyan, CEO of Recom, to provide perspectives from a European-based manufacturer on U.S. solar energy goals, supply chain issues, and advancements in heterojunction technology. Vartan and Hamlet have chosen to bring this presentation to you via a pre-recorded video, and we'll get on that in just a second here. Then they'll join us live for a brief question and answer section afterwards. Without further ado, let's get into it.
Hello everyone, I'm Hamlet Tunyan, CEO of Recom.
Well, hello, I'm Vartan Oskanian, advisor to the CEO. Hamlet, you want to start? You want me to start?
Please.
Let me first thank you all for joining us, and also the PV Magazine for providing this opportunity. Let me start with a quick word about Recom. Recom is a France-based renewable energy company with a notable presence in the global solar industry. Recom produces modules, cells, inverters, hybrid storage systems, and soon also to be producing batteries and EV chargers. Recom is a leading and the only Bloomberg Tier 1 PV module manufacturer in Europe with 750 megawatt annual production capacity and with cells of over 2 gigawatt modules in 95 countries. Well, along to our own manufacturing facility in France and local R&D team, we invest in and work with leading global research institutions and manufacturers to innovate, develop, share, and commercialize the latest technological advances in solar module manufacturing. Well, one of the topics that we were pursuing in the past several years was the heterojunction technology, to which we will come back a little later. Well, solar, there's no doubt, is on the rise, but fueling solar's continued rise will take all kinds of innovations, technological, financial, and systemic. But equally important are the innovations and creativity in state legislation and public policy, including trade policy. Well, China today has emerged as the solar industry's largest producer and consumer. On one hand, we need Chinese products. There's not much supply elsewhere. On the other hand, we all want to lessen United States and West in general dependence on China. There's a real dilemma there, and public policy and legislation in that sense matters a great deal. Well, today, both Europe and US are dependent on China, partly due to their legislation and trade policy of the past few decades. The energy transformation promises Europe to leave the current energy dependence, where needs to import fossil fuel for its energy consumption, instead now to enter a new type of energy dependence of importing necessary components for the renewable energy installations. In the post-COVID period, however, things are changing legislative-wise as Europe begins to shift policy. More European cell and module manufacturers are entering the market. Low carbon footprint requirements are returning as prerequisites in public tenders. And hopefully we will see soon more balanced trade policy for renewables value chain. Well, the US have their share of complications in this field due to various trade remedy actions taken over the course of the past few years. Solar panels are 50% more expensive in the United States than the global average. Tariffs are largely responsible for this. Around 30% of solar, 90% of solar panels and their components are manufactured outside the United States. So there's a dependency issue there too. In 2018, for example, safeguard measures were put in place for 4 years period beginning February 2018, which should be phased out by February next year. Then there's the issue of blocking shipments of panels containing components of potentially derived from forced labor in China. China's Xinjiang region, yet there is a possibility of additional restrictions on products originating from Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand. Well, given that growth in the solar energy industry is directly correlated with cost, so a lot will depend as how much and in what direction the prices will go. Despite all this, however, the shipping bottlenecks, these legislative restraints, and also jump in costs, the US solar installations were running at a record pace. Thus, the US need to balance all these things in a manner that not today's growing solar market cool down tomorrow. Well, in doing so, we believe, however, that U.S. Import policy criteria should be anchored, among other things, on three main considerations: respect for international labor laws, low carbon footprint, and the issue of state subsidies. Well, Hamlet, I believe despite all this, we as European manufacturers was not much affected with these legislative restrictions in the U.S. in this past few years. I believe you agree with me on this.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Thank you, Vartan. Well, in fact, the U.S. is a very important market for us. We have presence there for almost a decade. We have established good partnership with distributors, utility companies, renewable funds, and developers. We have seen the ups and downs of the market, but in general, it has been good for us. We have always had the flexibility to adapt to new legislation and manage to remain competitive. We are seeing increased demand from the US, and we believe our sales to the US will continue to grow in the coming months and the years. We have even had and still have plans to manufacture in the US. In 2018, for example, we have hired a US consulting firm to help us explore a possibility of building heterojunction gigafab in the US. We met with them, with several state governors, site locations have been chosen, incentives were offered. New York was among them, and we were expecting a very generous financial input from the state, but their disappointing experience with Tesla's failed attempt in Buffalo, where the Teslas had given 800 million grant and was wasted, had put a damper on their enthusiasm to host a new gigafab in New York. In fact, Tesla offered their space to Recom to utilize for its gigafab. So at that time, our financial expectations were not met. Then the COVID-19 struck and our efforts stopped. Anyway, our plans to have production in the US is still in our mind. So today, Recom, as a European manufacturer with a module production facility at the edge of the Atlantic coast in France, is in a pretty advantageous position. So we are bound by EU laws and regulation. Our shipping cost to the US is relatively low, and our products have a very low carbon footprint. To give you an example, Recom has supply chain transparency and carbon footprint certificates since 2011. This certificate shows all the sources of the materials used in the module and their carbon footprint values. I will just give you now an example. You will see now the slide for the certificate, and I will explain you a couple of things about it. All right, here is a certificate of coming from Solis, and this is an evaluation of the carbon footprint, but also showing the transparency where the materials are coming from. Here you can see on the left side, for example, here where it says the reference modules, we can see the technology, the type of the modules. This one is an older certificate, just for an example, since from 2015, showing the technology, which is the 60 cells, the monocrystalline, the polycrystalline. We can see here on the power, that is the 260 watts here, for just an example. It's a polysilicon ingot, wafer, cell, where the modules are made, the glass, where it's coming from, the EVA, the PET, and the PVF. So we see on the right side where it comes from. So for example, the polysilicon, 90% is coming from Germany, and there's a 10% that is coming from Korea. The ingot is 100% made in France. The cells are 100% made in France. The modules are 100% made in France. The glass is, it comes either from Belgium or it comes either from Japan. The EVA comes from Japan, and the PET comes from Germany. And below we can see different methodologies of the combination of the carbon footprint scenarios. We see here on the back side, this is the how many kilos, how many CO2 has each power. We can see the higher the power, the lower the carbon footprint. So as an example, you can see here again from the 250 up to 280. So the 250, for example, this is the mono. We see the 258 kilos for the 250 watts, and then we can see 230 kilos for the 280 watts, whereas the poly we see 260 for the 250 watts and 233 kilos CO2 on the 280 watts. All right, thank you.
Restart. Now let us move to the introduction of Recom's heterojunction technology Lion series module. Well, heterojunction technology is a solar panel production method that has picked up steam in the last decade. The technology is currently the solar industry's best option to increase efficiency and power output to their highest level. Heterojunction combines the best qualities of crystalline silicon with those of thin film to produce a high-power hybrid cell that surpasses the performance of the industry's go-to technology, PERC. It helps to lower costs, increase efficiency, and improve reliability. Here you see the heterojunction technology advantages: high efficiency, higher output, low temperature coefficients, no LID and PID, low irradiance performance, bifaciality, thin wafer, and warranty up to 30 years. Here, the type of modules Recom produces in aesthetic terms, silver and black frame, both are available, and of different sizes. Also, bifacial models are available with heterojunction technology. Here, the use of different cell sizes, M6, 120 cells reaches up 395 watt power, 140 cells, 44 cells reaches up to 475. Then the G12 cell size with 80 cells, we reach up to 430 watt power, and with 120 cells up to 640 watt power. The same G12, bigger size, 132 cells, we reach up to 700 watt power. Here again, high temperature qualifications of the heterojunction technology. The warranty has already been mentioned, up to 30 years product warranty. The benefits of heterojunction module at a glance. Here you see the low LCOE, which is very important for producers and investors, higher light conversion. Now let me very quickly go over a few very important characteristics: higher output power, low power loss, low degradation, very important. At the end of the warranty time, 30 years, we still have over 91.25% performance. Now the lowest temperature coefficient we've talked about, high performance in under high temperature, and bifaciality compared to other standard types, mono PERC. Heterojunction has over 90% instead of 70%. And better low irradiance response of the panel. So these are basically the characteristics of heterojunction, which is available at Recom.
I would like to welcome you to the studio now, Vartan. I know Hamlet was originally supposed to join us, but he must be on a quest to deliver the best solar panel possible. So in the meantime, your presentation must have been incredibly comprehensive. I know it was. I just watched it because we don't appear to have any audience questions. So I want to ask you very briefly, what will it take for Recom to make a positive investment decision in the U.S.? And then kind of as a follow-up, do you see that positive environment in the near future? We're having brief audio problems here, but we'll get that restored. Ah, there's Hamlet. Thank you for joining, Hamlet.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having us.
So same question I posed to Vartan there, and we were having audio issues, so we'll get your perspective on this now. What will it take for Recom to make a positive investment decision in the U.S., and do you see an environment for that decision, a positive one, coming in the near future?
Hello?
Hi. Are we clear? All right, we seem to have lost Hamlet and Vartan, which is incredibly unfortunate, but I would like to thank them very much for the presentation that they prepared for us, and also for being our networking partner here today. They provide a little bit of perspective to take us out of our American bubble and, you know, give a better scope to an industry issue that's typically framed, especially in the United States, as to just the US and China. So once again, Hamlet Tunyan and Vartan Oskanian from Recom, thank you very much for joining us today. Howdy. Well, most of the focus of today's discussions have been on solar. It's not the only technology that's going to be driving the clean energy transition. In the coming years, energy storage is set to play a major role, with widespread adoption helping to ease the intermittency of renewable resources while also alleviating some of the grid pressures related to adding vast amounts of renewable energy. As battery storage becomes more widespread, different chemistries will emerge to fill different roles and to support the proliferation of more renewables. I'd like to now introduce two speakers, one who spends her days working on such battery chemistry innovations, and another who's developing ways to underwrite and cover breakthrough technologies, giving investors the confidence to support their procurement. For our next session, we will be joined by Ann Marie Augustus, co-founder and vice president of operations with Urban Electric Power, a company with an innovative twist on a traditional storage technology. Ann Marie will be joined by George Schulz, vice president of clean energy at Ariel Re, which has recently made a breakthrough in energy storage underwriting. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Ann Marie,
Hi, thanks.
Of course. Ann Marie, I'd like to start off here by giving you a few moments to discuss the storage solution that you're pursuing and have created with Urban Electric Power, and the breakthrough that enabled such a solution.
Sure, thanks so much. So as you mentioned, we're working on kind of an innovation on the existing primary alkaline technology. So most folks are familiar with the primary Duracell or Energizer AA or C cell. And we take that same technology, which is a zinc and manganese dioxide cell, and make it rechargeable. We started that research at the City University of New York at the CUNY Energy Institute, where the technology was originally invented. And zinc has been rechargeable for a long time, but the real innovation for the company was to work on the manganese dioxide cathode. And through certain dopates and additives and through a certain structure to the cathode, we're able to kind of break that rechargeability barrier. And now we are offering that rechargeable alkaline technology to the masses.
Incredible. Why is alkaline better than lithium ion for stationary storage? I know in previous conversations you've highlighted that as a strength of your solution. So if you could go in on that a little bit.
Sure. There's a few reasons that I think differentiate alkaline from lithium chemistry. The first is the cost. So some of the talks that had happened earlier today were really talking about the problem with supply chain and supply scarcity. And what we offer really is a zinc manganese dioxide solution. So zinc is 140 times more zinc processed annually than lithium right now in the world. Manganese is the fourth most abundant element on the periodic table. So that abundancy gives us an alternative in the market to meet the scale of the problem. That abundancy also keeps costs very, very low. So we can offer a low-cost solution that we think will be required for stationary grid scale or solar plus storage applications. And additionally, the alkaline is very, very safe. So no issues with thermal runaway and no requirement for active or passive cooling. So in high temperature environments, if you want a solution that's not required to have HVAC to run, the alkaline alternative can be a good fit.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of your batteries running, I understand you have a couple of ongoing demonstration projects showing off the efficacy of Urban Electric's solution. Do you want to take a little bit of time to get into those projects, kind of why you were approached for your solution and how they've been performing?
Sure. So the first big project that we're doing this year is actually a lead acid replacement project with the San Diego Supercomputer Center. So in that use case, we are replacing a 15-minute lead acid system with a 2-hour rechargeable alkaline system. And the reason why San Diego wanted more duration was because of regulatory constraints that are no longer allowed to site any additional diesel power backup. So the alkaline system could be a 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt hour system that we were able to get fire marshal approval and permitting to safely site indoors and give them that longer duration. Additionally, which may be more relevant to folks on today's conference, is we're doing some projects with Sandia National Labs and the Navajo Tribal Utility, which are solar microgrid use cases where we kind of drop in these remote parts of southwestern United States, solar plus storage, where the alkaline technology can really shine because of that robustness and higher temperature performance.
Absolutely. I like the Sandia connection. We just had Nicole on earlier. George, turning to you now, thank you for joining our discussion today. As a fairly nascent and recently emerging industry, I understand there's some confusion regarding insuring storage assets. I'm also sure that with the different potential chemistries and usages and rapid evolution of the industry, that confusion grows. Ariel Re, as I understand, has achieved a breakthrough in storage coverage. Do you mind expanding on that?
Sure. Thanks for having us today. And I think to Ann Marie's point, and part of what we think our role as an insurer is to try to help technology adoption, acceptance, and quite frankly, bankability. And so we view that we are basically technology agnostic in terms of what we will insure. We've looked at a variety of different types of technology platforms, even flywheel. But what we recently did was actually with a lithium-ion technology provider called Powin. I wouldn't so much as call it a breakthrough as it was an accomplishment, because it was took quite some time to underwrite their technology, their supply chains, and ultimately it enabled us to ensure the capacity warranty for Powin for a utility scale project for a project that was developed by Invenergy. And I think, we've been doing this, or we've been insuring solar performance risk for quite some time, and I think this is a signal to how insurance can support and enhance various technologies in the storage market. So I think the real challenge for that one was, as far as lithium-ion, was overcoming some of the confidentiality and obstacles about getting some of the third-party data from the cell suppliers for a lithium integrator. But nonetheless, thanks for letting us talk about that, and we hope to support more technologies going forward.
Of course. Getting into a little bit of specifics here, what does Ariel Re look for in underwriting storage, maybe in terms of data and metrics that are required, and what a sufficient amount of testing on a solution would be?
Yeah, so I think the first thing we'll look to is the warranty itself and the warranty language, and what kind of quantitative performance metrics are outlined in that. And then we'll look to see what kind of data is available to back up those claims or those assertions of what that warranty is. And so we'll also look for any unique aspects. For example, is there some incorporating those performance expectations? Is there some level of augmentation or other types of things, or other limitations on how the battery is supposed to be performing in any particular use case or environment? So, I mean, I guess our underwriting is interactive with the client, and we strive to be as creative as we can. But in the end, data is king, and we're driven by what we're able to deliver in terms of a coverage according to how we can model it.
Absolutely. We're getting a little bit close on time here, so I'd like to ask one more question to each of you. We'll start with you, George, and then we will round out our conversation with you, Ann Marie. First, George, how does the approach of insuring storage assets differ with non-lithium ion and emerging chemistries where, you know, there may not be as much information available? And I know you said data is king, so what happens when that data is a little bit less?
Yeah, I mean, as I alluded to earlier with our first business case, which was lithium ion, I think the challenge there was really relying on our insured customer to secure the sufficient amount of data that we needed to underwrite, but it was based on cell data from a third-party supplier. I think that obstacle is to some extent overcome with non-lithium technologies we've worked with, because they're not necessarily beholden to someone else's data to help us underwrite that risk. Nonetheless, there are still challenges. We look to any kind of third-party failure mode analysis or IE reports, but also essentially at the end we're largely relying on lab test data. And hopefully some field test data if it's available, but primarily it's lab test data to get us from point A to point B to determine not only whether it's an insurable risk, but whether we're able to price it in a way that's commercially reasonable for them and for their customers.
Ann Marie, we had an audience question for you, and they were asking about the possibility for using your zinc technology as a long duration, maybe residential storage solution. Has there been any exploration by Urban Electric into, you know, kind of these non-utility, non-large commercial scale applications of the product, maybe in a residential sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, I think the leap to go from the alkaline batteries already in your home, it's in your smoke alarms, it's in your children's toys, to have that technology be a safe, low-cost alternative that could potentially be sited in the basement or in the garage because of the safety elements, I believe is very compelling to compete with some of the lithium alternatives. It de-risks the solution as well because of the safety factors. And I do believe that utilities will be wise to really get in front of some of the residential stationary storage products and look to try to aggregate these units and maybe lease and operate them. Some utilities like Green Mountain Power in Vermont is already considering doing this. So the alkaline technology is scalable. It's just like lead or lithium, it can scale up or down. And certainly we would like to pursue all of those markets, and residential is one of them.
Phenomenal. Well, I know that I'm very excited to see where Urban Electric goes with this technology. I'm really excited for your guys' future. So I'd like to thank you, Ann Marie, and thank you, George, for joining us today. And not to only compliment Urban Electric, but George, I'm excited to see how the underwriting market evolves for storage, because, you know, that's pretty critical for investor confidence, pretty critical for proliferation. So I thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah.
Solar's moment is here. As we've learned so far today, the resource represents an abundant, affordable, resilient, and flexible source of clean energy. As such, it is uniquely able to underpin what needs to be both a rapid decarbonization and widespread electrification if goals laid out at the Glasgow Climate Change Summit are to be achieved.
On top of that, as land acquisition becomes tighter, projects become harder to site, new supplemental technologies emerge, and the country's drivers increase their adoption of electric vehicles, the energy landscape of the U.S. is set to rapidly transform, which seems to be the term of the day.
Joining us to talk about how well solar can play with everything from electric vehicles to hydrogen is our panel, which includes Masoud Amin, an IEEE Fellow and Professor of Electrical Engineering at the University of Minnesota, Chris Gordon, Project Development Manager with EDF Renewables North America, Marlene Motyka, the U.S. and Global Renewable Energy Leader with Deloitte, and Carl Rabago, Principal with Rabago Energy, and also a former regulator and executive with Austin Energy. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Now, we may not be able to answer this question in our time here, but to frame the conversation a bit, solar faces a tremendous opportunity to become a major generation resource in this country. However, the road to that outcome is neither smooth nor straight. In other words, kind of how do we make sure we're innovating the right way to start on this journey? And I just want to do an aside, and Masoud, this comes from your former shop at the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, just today, where they laid out what they thought would have to happen by 2030 in order to work down this road towards decarbonization. We look at, they say that achieving the 2030 U.S. goal means tripling the recent pace of decarbonization, that they foresee electricity use increasing by up to 23% as economy-wide dependence on clean energy grows. And then there also needs, as the electric system expands to support the clean energy economy, overall energy costs go on to decline for many households. So those are critical questions to address in terms of how solar can underpin this transformation, this rapid transformation that we heard at the beginning of the session from Garrett Nilsen. And I wondered, to get us started down this road, Masoud, I wonder if you would be good enough to take maybe 60 seconds or so to walk us through the last 120 years of electricity history and bring us up to the point where we are today. Just briefly, concisely, 120 years. Take it away.
Thank you so very much, David, colleagues, distinguished panelists, and Tim. Honored to be here. So I'm going to talk fast because I went to high school in Cornwall in Hudson, New York, near where the Thomas Edison and Tesla really started building it and investing us. So when you look back, the National Academy of Engineering at the turn of the century in 2020 mapped out the most transformative technologies that transformed our economy, had the biggest impact on human life, on our economy, on everything, quality of life. You would have thought man going on the moon or television or transportation were the ones that they would choose. They choose the North American power grid. And they said something along the lines, and that was a blue ribbon panel led by Neil Armstrong. And they said that the vast networks of electrification are the greatest achievement of engineering in the 20th century. However, this greatest achievement is transforming, albeit slowly. As my colleagues at EPRI, Department of Energy, elsewhere, your previous panelists have pointed out, it's slow change in America. It's a big ship. And to share with you that change a little bit, look back to Industrial Revolution, 1850 to the present in North America, really quickly. About 90% of our energy sources, and by energy, I mean everything. Of course, electrons are the best carrier, the most efficient carrier of energy. 90% came from, back then, from wood. 10% came from coal. Fast forward to 1880. That had dropped to about 60%, 58% from wood, the rest from coal. In 1900s, early 1900s, oil, natural gas, and other things kicked in. And then in 1960s, nuclear. So fast forward, as our population grew, going from hydro dams up in northern New York, we moved to hydro dams, coal, later on nuclear and natural gas, and a little bit of also wind as we built it. Now, more and more, we are going from centralized power to distributed power. And often people get into a fight. Do we need microgrids and totally distributed power, or do we need a stronger backbone for the transmission? The answer is not one of or, is one of and. We need both to capture and bring it together with storage. If you're interested, there's a great IEEE book that came out, 125 Years of Electricity, Foundations of Electricity, in 2016. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. They go through the history of electrification. 130 years ago, Pearl Street DC generating plant in 1882, Vulcan Street DC hydroelectric plant. First central station in South Carolina was the same year. 1882 was the beginning of that bifurcation. And then you had the first windmill to produce electricity built in Scotland in 1887. Then you have first American windmill in the following year in winter of 1888. And then International Electrotechnical Exhibition in Frankfurt, Germany, not too far from you, in 1891. You fast forward in the power technology timeline all the way to smart grid that began in 1998. Then you have the optical first patent for optical transformers that can be any size, can be applied to a microgrid and incorporate solar with storage, etc., was just 11 years ago in May of 2010. There is a lot of potential for innovation, for markets and policy to actually, in conjunction with innovation, to move the technology forward, particularly because the average age of our system in North America is 40 to 60 years old. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Masoud, for that for the introduction. And Marlene, I want to turn to you and ask you, on that basis, what common perceptions about renewable energy are more myth than reality? Deloitte has done some research around that, some recent work around that. I wonder if you could take a moment and describe those common myths.
Yeah, I'm going to highlight 2 of the 5 that we noted in our paper. And this first one still is quite mind-boggling, but a lot of people really still feel that wind and solar is too expensive and that they're only competitive with conventional generation because of government credits and incentives. But really, solar and wind have become the cheapest power generation source across most of the US, but also even globally. And that's without some credits and incentives in place. And costs continue to fall. And in many cases, the cost it costs less to build new wind and solar plants than it is to continue operating some existing coal-fired plants. So that's the first misconception I want to put out there. The second one is that intermittency is a major obstacle, and more than 10% penetration of variable wind and solar sources on the grid would destabilize it. And that wind and solar need to be backed up 1-to-1 with conventional generation, which is too costly. And, certainly power systems in most countries and actually in many states are already operating at more than 50% penetration of wind and solar annually without any of that impacting on reliability. There are challenges to integrating variable renewable energy resources. Certainly that's real, but the US has variable renewable energy penetration already of 11% nationwide, and Iowa has 58% and Kansas has 43%, and there isn't any impact on reliability. And there are certainly some countries that are operating at more than 50%. So I think we're poised really well to continue to grow our renewable energy base. You mentioned the fact that we'll need a lot more renewable generation to meet our decarbonization goals. And certainly we can get there with wind and solar. Mm-hmm.
Chris, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about some of the siting challenges that are common with distributed generation resources. We're going to need all sorts of distributed resources along with utility scale in order to achieve some of those ambitious goals. But what are you seeing currently as the main siting challenges, and how can those be dealt with and broken down, if you will?
Sure. Yeah, I think that distribution scale generation is definitely where the industry is headed currently, and it does. It does mean some significant siting challenges for small-scale solar projects. So what you need to have is land that's close to the electric centers or close to the load centers. So, you know, and typically, if you think of where the electric load is, it's where people live, it's where businesses are, and it's where land is expensive. So it poses some problems as far as siting and finding enough open land to build a big enough project to match the load, and as well as simply the NIMBY aspect of it, which is there's been significant opposition at a local level in densely populated residential areas that simply don't want a solar facility near where they live. So the local opposition has been in the form of just vocal organizing, as well as local zoning laws and ordinances that have been put in place to really challenge development. So what we're doing on the development side is, we're trying to get creative as much as we can with development and siting of these small solar facilities. Utilization of brownfields is always a good opportunity, or other environmentally sensitive properties that would otherwise be unusable land. They're often located near distribution load centers, and it's not expensive land for the most part. Another area that we're really delving into recently is floating solar. It's another example of developers and business owners getting creative with siting. Floating solar has the potential to really unlock the value of industries that are based around water bodies. So these can be behind the meter or for utility distribution scale possibilities. The water bodies are typically close to urban areas and load centers, and oftentimes they are utilized at nuclear or fossil fuel generation facilities, and so the distribution and transmission infrastructure is already in place.
Carl Rothergo, I'd like to turn to you and talk a little bit about, the premise of this discussion a bit is solar underpinning electrification and decarbonization. And it seems that there are maybe three models that could be followed. One would be a utility-centric, where there would be a lot of capital that could be deployed. There could be some questions around the ability to innovate rapidly enough. There could be another, perhaps not the other extreme, but another option could be around really distributed energy resources, where there's a high level of innovation, but perhaps not that same sort of capital intensity. I wonder if you could start the discussion and talk about some of the pros and cons around these two different models, and perhaps how they might be blended so that it can really, solar can really play the major role in electrification and decarbonization. Carl, what do you think?
Well, Masood teed this up perfectly by mentioning Neil Armstrong, and it gives me a chance to tell my favorite joke that was never told. And the joke goes that on the way to the moon, Neil Armstrong said, "I hope the lowest bidder didn't get the contract." And while he didn't actually say that, what he said was much more profound about one giant leap and all that. The point is that price alone cannot dictate the optimal solution, nor can any other single criteria. So the correct focus is actually on maximizing value. And that means taking advantage of both the large scale and the small scale. There are benefits with the utility scale. You can, if you have transmission, you can site facilities for time value. For example, Texas enjoys the fact that wind and solar are produced west of most of the load centers. So the production output is good. It extends into the later hours of the day. but you can't choose for locational benefit like you can with distributed resources. Distributed resources can be sized, right-sized to match the load more precisely and elegantly, which prevents overbuilding. The utilities are masters at harvesting and deploying capital, but they also have a penchant towards monopolization. The distributed market is much younger and needs and has a more difficult, challenging time in some cases getting capital and getting customers and getting those siting problems, like Chris mentioned, overcome. So what we find is that once we have the capacity to analyze the pros and the cons of utility and distributed installations in real time, or with models that have sophistication sufficient to actually compare the resources side by side, is that we need a lot more distributed resources. But they also enable utility scale resources. And the best answer is going to be, again, a nod to Masoud, it's going to be an and answer, not an or answer.
And Chris, as someone who is who's on the distributed side of things, distributed resources as an enabler of utility scale, I wonder, is that something that that you're looking at and you're thinking about as you look for deployments? What's your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're focused on the distribution scale projects. So, you know, one of the things we're trying to do is like Carl mentioned, is we're matching the load with the size of the project. It helps with the siting. It keeps the energy local as well, and I think that's a major benefit of small distribution scale projects, and also helps with the NIMBYism that I mentioned earlier, in the sense that the facilities that are sited close to the residential areas or closer, the energy is staying on the distribution system. It is technically not allowed, based on our interconnection agreements, to be backfeed onto the transmission system. Therefore, the energy that's generated stays within that community. It stays on the distribution system that's serving those customers located and living in the vicinity of the projects.
And Masoud, let me ask you, because you've spent a lot of your career dealing with innovation in the electricity grid, and I'm wondering how you frame this issue between the pros and the cons of going of full out, if you will, with utility involvement in delivering the solar solution that leads to electrification and decarbonization, as opposed to a more decentralized and this and issue that you raised at the top of our session. I wonder if you could expand a little bit about that and how we should think about innovation and how it is best handled.
Thank you very much, David, for asking that. I'm really honored. I'm listening to our colleagues on the panel. I'm just blown away. We collectively, all of us, together with the two of you, should write a book on this, seriously. So having done, I did military, the Department of Defense, combat systems, so-called C4I from 82 to 97. And then from January of 98 at EPRI, and later on at Technological Leadership Institute at the University of Minnesota, I've done civilian infrastructure, mostly energy, electricity, telecom, and security, and systemic analysis, risk, policy, transition, pathways. You have to do it in a very, how should I say it? You have to have high EQ, emotional quotient, high spiritual quotient, knowing the true north, but having a vision, having a point of view. But it has to be determined by evidence and data and science. To give you an example, the cost of photovoltaics from the time that President Carter, when I first came to America, put them on the White House, on top of the White House in 1976 or 77, solar photovoltaic module cost, dollars per megawatt, have dropped 99% since 1976. Efficiency has gone up. It has improved 80% since 2008. lithium-ion battery, storage, and we can talk about different modes of storage. I published an article in Public Utility Fortnightly, and I advise boards and CEOs and CTOs and CIOs and CFOs. You got to start with the CFO, actually, in my humble view. Make sure you make a business case about it. And I wrote an article on microgrids and storage in terms of battery storage in search of an enlightened energy policy and innovation back in like 5 years ago. That's in Public Utility Fortnightly. I think it was January. I submitted it early before Thanksgiving. But anyway, in a nutshell, we are learning. There's a learning, if you graph that, as the cost is going down, there's a learning curve to that. Your learning rate is about 24 or 25%. We are learning a lot. And this is before China overwhelmed the market with their cheap panels. If you look globally, Denmark, to some extent Germany, China, other nations are actually leading that area. In the US, we only went from 9% to about 13% on renewable energy proportion generation, etc. If you look at Gujarat, talking about global, in India, which is very innovative state, they had the most polluting part of India. And they added wind and solar, and I can talk about it some other time, but in terms of energy transition and going from being in red to being in green from 2004, doing that, absorbing the initial cost, investment in the infrastructure to becoming in the green in 2006 and then continuing to be in green is amazing. I mean, it's a great story.
Masood, yes. I'm sorry.
David,
I want to bring Marlene into the.
You're ready.
Yeah, I'd like to bring Marlene into the discussion here, and with the myths that your report addresses. I wonder if, with what you have heard so far, how those may be changed, given what we've been discussing up till now. How are those affected, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree that I think we have an and situation here with utility scale and DER both. I mean, if we think about trying to decarbonize the power sector between 2035 and 2050, we're going to need 7 to 100 gigawatts each of wind and solar a year. So that's a lot. So we need everything. I think one thing to think about there is supply chain, right? We've had some challenges with supply chain recently, but there's been a much more focus on supply chain and looking at different options to manufacture, certain components more broadly across the world. Also looking at, the actual, materials that we need to build out wind and solar, and looking at how viable those are and what countries they're available in. And the other thing to think about here is transmission, right? If we have a lot more utility-centric renewables, we're going to need transmission. There's a big focus on transmission now, but we would need more transmission. And DER, when you're looking at that provides some non-wires alternatives. And then I think the last thing I want to say is, regardless of whether we're at utility centric or we're at DER or distributed, the regulatory and policy is very important. Right now, our regulatory markets are they're lagging innovation, and they need to maintain and keep up to speed with this innovation that's happening and the new types of products and services that are being added to the grid. I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And Carl Rabago, you had a point that you wanted to make a moment ago. Let me bring you in.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. One of the things that it is absolutely important to understand this relationship between utility scale and distributed is that you cannot just focus on busbar cost, right? Because as Chris mentioned, these resources work in different places. So the load that a distributed energy system serves and the utility system serves are the same distributed load, but it's very, very different how the electricity gets there. So you need a systems view as what does it take to move that electricity and when will it be available and how does that correspond with the load? So you just don't look at just busbar cost, you also look at complementaries. For example, distributed storage. some work that we've been doing at the local Solar for All Coalition using the wisdom model from Dr. Christopher Clack at Vibrant Clean Energy shows us that when you actually evaluate the utility and distributed resources on an optimized basis, what ends up happening is that distributed resources, solar plus storage, don't just satisfy load, they actually change the shape of the load. And by doing so, it gets more value out of the range of output from utility scale resources. Our analysis shows that you actually can reduce utility system costs, not just at the peak, when most people think distributed resources are most valuable, and they are, but across 80% of the operating hours in a year. And the takeaway numbers are huge for the United States, for the lower 48 United States. You could save over $100 billion in resource cost out to just 2030, and over $1 trillion out to 2050 if you electrify the economy and if you optimize your distributed resources. But we're going to need 100+ gigawatts of distributed resources to unlock all that system-wide value. And we have to think about that. Think of distributed as load shaping, not just load serving, in order to make those resources really work for us.
Let me turn to Tim Sylvia. He's got a question from our audience. And again, a reminder for our live audience to please submit your questions for our panel. We'll be happy to throw your questions into the mix for our panel members. Tim, what are you hearing?
Yeah, just someone from the audience wanted to know if HVDC would be considered as infrastructure development, and would it solve any of the potential intermittency issues associated with renewables?
I see Masood is raising his hand. Very good. Thank you. Masood, yes, please. A professor and a student, please.
Thank you. I'm a student. This goes back to the original current wars between Tesla and Edison and the history of that. But bottom line is we do have the technology now to do 800 kV or lower DC high voltage lines effectively, efficiently, get more controllability, get less loss, and even high temperature superconducting cables. We have done it for Detroit Edison, we have done it for New York. This was my old job at EPRI as the head of grid operations and planning, energy markets, risk and policy assessment, and critical infrastructure security and protection. In a nutshell, China already has that Siemens technology for 800 kV DC lines. So coming back to one of our distinguished panelists said, currently in North America, we have about 450 or 60,000 miles of high voltage lines, 100 kV or higher. If we augment that with 9% more, with 42,000 miles more, at a cost of about $2 million per mile, about $84 billion. $84 billion compared to other big numbers is not huge. If you phase it over 5 years or 10 years, we can bring where you have the resources on wind, on hydro, on solar, etc., renewables into major population density centers, as well as the bylines around them. That can be done. You can even retrofit the North American power grid with that strong DC backbone at an affordable cost. The cost-benefit analysis, 14,000 jobs that Brattle Group has assessed. The analysis I'm sharing with you, I did that as the head of GOP, Grid Operations and Planning at EPRI. AEP for the first time, that operates in 18 states, for the first time in North American utility, did a systemic assessment for North American interconnection. And then DOE did that. Not only it behooves us to do that economically, security, resilience, countering climate change, making a more resilient infrastructure, it makes amazing sense.
Carl, let me come back and throw another scenario at you. We've talked about sort of the role that investor-owned utilities, that large-scale utilities can play in distributed. And I wonder, as we think about adding electric vehicles to the mix, as we think about adding green hydrogen to the mix, how does this discussion around innovation and who is best able to do that, how does that change when we throw those extra elements into it? What should we be thinking about, do you think? Carl?
Well, there's a couple dimensions here. The first dimension is markets, right? And we know that monopolies, while they can leverage huge amounts of capital because of their 100-year history, they are also not known for being the most rapid innovators. So you always need the right amount of that big capital for the big solution, but always trying to sort of bring in the innovative forces that market competition can bring along with it. The United States has been the largest, most successful free market capitalistic democracy the world has ever known. And it remains an interesting question why one of our most important infrastructure industries is still run as a monopoly, in spite of that commitment to capitalism. And the answer is that we choose the model that does things best. So when we need lots of capital, when there's an underserved market that is very difficult and challenging for innovators to serve, utilities can step into this. This was the rules we established in the New York Rev, for example, when we looked at animating markets for distributed energy resources. There are low and moderate income markets that are not quite attractive enough for innovators to go after. Okay, fine. Utilities have a means for socializing those costs and providing those benefits. But there are also some people who want 15 kilowatts on their roof. This shouldn't be a regulatory decision. This is about partnering with your local solar provider, a competitive business who gives you the right combination of solar and storage to meet your needs and maximize your return, whether it's direct monetary or other kind of return that you want to have. So it's another and answer that says, let's not monopolize this market too soon, if maybe never at all. Let's exploit the forces of free market competition and maybe even let some utilities participate in it, providing they don't exercise market power, so that we can really keep things moving forward, but also have the wedge behind it that gives us the massive amount of transformation we need if we're going to deal with climate in a realistic and prompt way.
And Chris, I want to bring you into the discussion with EDF and think about this idea of distributed resources as underpinning electrification. When we look at electric vehicles and we look at things like hydrogen, how does that support the model that you're putting forward? What are the implications for your efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So EDF Renewables, the PowerFlex brand operating under EDF Renewables, is doing some really great innovative work with solar storage, EV charging stations, as well as their energy management system. So we have teams of software engineers that are driving this innovation, and a lot of it is dependent on not only the actual infrastructure, the solar panels, the batteries, but this energy management system is crucial. There's a number of algorithms behind it that they decide when to export power, when to store power, the best time to charge the vehicles, and it turns your standard EV charging system into like a smart charging system with user inputs and many other different features. And we're finding that this is, again, like what Carl was saying, this is key to unlocking the value of these systems. And not only are you going to implement an EV charging system for your fleet, but you're going to be saving significantly on rate reductions, on peak rate reductions, exporting power when it's most financially viable and valuable to your company, as well as all the green technology benefits that we're all here for.
Very good. Well, that brings to a close an excellent and thought-provoking discussion. Our thanks to Masoud Amin of the University of Minnesota, Chris Gordon from EDF Renewables, Marlene Motyka from Deloitte, and Carl Rabigo of Rabigo Energy.
That also brings to a close this year's Roundtables USA. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've looked at challenges that extreme weather and climate change can have on solar systems. We've talked about the growing adoption of large format modules and the unique challenges that these form factors can present. We've looked at performance issues and seen how technologies like electroluminescence can be a tool to maintain high levels of performance. We've also learned about some exciting new technologies and gained a greater understanding of how software can enhance solar project performance and reliability. We've heard from the Department of Energy and gained better insight into the Biden administration's ambitious goals to rapidly expand solar deployment.
And we've also heard from major industry players on what concrete steps need to be taken if the U.S. is to meet those ambitious targets for solar. We've talked about global supply chains, domestic labor shortages, and the opportunity to expand U.S.-based manufacturing. Finally, we've gotten perhaps a clearer picture of how solar can play a leading role in widespread efforts to decarbonize and electrify economies, including the all-important transportation sector.
On PV Magazine USA's website, we will continue to cover these important topics. Also, every month, we are releasing a brand new edition of our global magazine. And as you might have seen already, there's a promo code to reward your participation today, and you can access our current edition for free. Check out our PV Magazine booth in the expo area for more details. You also have a chance to win a subscription. After every session, we ask for your feedback. Below the live stream or in the menu on your left, you can see a link to this session survey. Let us know what you thought of the last 2 hours, and you might be the lucky winner. And of course, none of this would be possible without the support of our and those who took part in this session: Recom Clean Energy Associates, Ariel Re, EDF Renewables, Shoals Technology. Thank you to all of our partners for their support. It's been a great event. I'm Tim Sylvia, and I look forward to connecting with you online at pvmagazineusa.com, as well as at future events and webinars.
And I'm David Wagman. It's been a real pleasure to moderate this year's Roundtables. On behalf of my colleague Ryan Kennedy, who live blogged this event, and all of us at PV Magazine, stay well, and thank you for attending.